Batman Arkham Origins is considered as one of the weakest entries in the Batman Arkham franchise, but that mostly came from the game being very buggy on release and still to this day, and because it wasn't as elevated in any way from the last game in the series, which was Arkham City. It was essentially that game but with a much bigger map. But aside from that, the story that the game presented along with the character development was really well crafted. The boss fights being the biggest success that came out of that game, as out of every game in the entire franchise, this game has always been named as having the best boss fights out of them all, and each one either introduces some unique mechanic we haven't seen before or is directed in such a way that's just overall amazing. Now, that doesn't mean that every boss fight in this game is just as amazing, so that's why in this video, we're going to be going over every single boss fight in Arkham Origins, ranking them from worst to best to answer the question, what are the best and worst boss fights in Batman Arkham Origins? And are they really the best in the entire series? Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Now let's get into it, shall we? The first boss fight we're going to go over is going to be at the number 10 position as the worst boss fight in this entire game, which is none other than Black Mask himself. Now, as a relatively significant character in the entire game, you'd think he'd be given a proper boss fight and actually have it done within the main story, as he's referenced multiple times as the main antagonist in the game before it's revealed that Joker was behind the entire operation the whole time. But no, he's just subjected to a side mission, which is basically a copycat of the Arkham City's Bane mission, but just much longer, with the final section taking place in the church and it being a stealth section. And once you finish that up, Black Mask finally appears somehow healthy as ever after being tortured by the Joker to give us one of the worst boss fights in the entire game, being a slightly harder combat section as you have to deal with a bunch of armored up goons instead of standard thugs you see throughout the game. And the whole thing is that you have to say Black Mask takedown until the end in order to complete it, as he goes down almost instantly if you do that. This is, in my opinion, one of the most disappointing encounters if I'm being honest, because this entire game was advertised and built up to be around Black Mask, as he was supposed to be the big bad in this game and had a significant part to play in the main story as well. But just to have that be ruined with a subpar side mission and a really basic boss fight that someone like Bird got, who's not even a part of the main story, was just not what should have been done for this character, and such a missed opportunity of a somewhat decent boss fight, as both him and Two-Face get pretty much the same treatment, where their side missions are both really boring and repetitive, and their boss fight is just really bad in the end. Overall, in my opinion, Black Mask's boss fight could have been so much better, as his mission should have taken place within the main story itself to eventually lead to a boss fight instead of just being subjected to a side mission and lead up to a really bad boss fight in the end. It was overall handled really badly, which is why it's at number 10 on this list as the worst boss fight in this entire game. But next up at the number 9 position on this list is the Anarchy boss fight, which again, just like Black Mask, is a really repetitive and boring side mission, which has you deactivating bombs told to you by 3 of his followers around the city, which eventually leads you to his hideout and his boss fight, which you can guess is a really prolonged combat section with 3 phases. And after the first 2, Anarchy stops shooting his RPG from the top and jumps down with a stun stick in hand and starts fighting alongside his minions to try and take you down. And just like the Black Mask fight, if you leave him as the last takedown, he goes down almost instantly as he surrenders to Batman. The only redeeming quality of this boss fight is after he's apprehended, you can speak to Anarchy directly, as he says some pretty interesting voice lines to Batman, and finally see how broken his character really is, as in the comics, he's actually not a villain but an anti-hero whose intentions are good but takes pretty enhanced precautions to prove his point, which is exactly what we see here, but he's treated as a villain since he tells Batman that his intentions is to cleanse the city from corruption it faces, but instead of doing something similar to Batman, he places bombs around the city, endangering many civilians, specifically where corruption is the highest. So yes, his intentions are good and Batman does say that, but the actions he took to achieve his goal and prove his point was just wrong, and that's literally the only giving moment in this entire mission, as everything else was just horrible, as the boss fight was a complete miss, with it just being a prolonged combat section just like the Black Mask fight. Now, if it was a really difficult fight or something, sure, I'd give it some credit, but the enemies were just basic thugs that we see on the regular, so it wasn't as bad to get through. Overall, Anarchy had the potential to be a really good villain in this game and to have a really well done boss fight, but just didn't, as the devs completely missed the mark on both the mission itself and the boss fight at the end, which is why this boss fight is number 9 on this list and one of the worst boss fights in this entire game. Deadshot is up next, number 8 on this list, and there really isn't much else to say about this other than it's a stealth section with a semi-decent side mission, but for those of you that don't know, essentially, Deadshot shoots down a helicopter that tries to apprehend Batman, and your mission is to set up a crime scene and find the origin of the shot and figure out who did it. And in the end, when you find out where the shot was taken and how it was performed, you figure out it had to be Deadshot because of how complicated the shot was to perform, as he's known as the world's greatest assassin after all. And once you trace the origin, you find the bullet and decode the number sequence written on it, bringing you to a radio signal that Deadshot left for you, telling you to meet him at the Gotham City Bank, as he has hostages with him ready to be killed, which ultimately leads you to the Gotham City Bank where Deadshot's boss fight takes place, which turns out to be just a Predator section with you having to take down Deadshot multiple times before you beat him. Now, most stealth sections in this game aren't that hard, as most times than not, it's pretty easy to take out a guy and leave before anyone else spots you, but in this one, the thugs spawn in indefinitely until you finally take out Deadshot, so it's literally impossible to take out all the thugs before getting to Deadshot himself. It also forces you to move around the room really quick, because as soon as you do something in the room, Deadshot spots you right away no matter how far he is from you. Now, the reason why Deadshot's fight is solo on this list is because he's one of the assassins in this game introduced at the beginning of the game, and just like like Black Mask, was subjected to a side mission even though he was supposed to have a part in the main story, as you can complete it without ever having to capture Deadshot once. The boss fight is also just a slightly harder stealth section. Yeah, we can go on and on about how much harder it is than all the other ones, but when it comes down to it, it's just a stealth section and it really isn't as much harder as some of the other stealth sections in this game. And I'm pretty sure there's at least one section in the main story that is actually harder than this boss fight, if I'm being honest. The only thing that makes this fight even harder than the slightest is having Deadshot being able to spot you from the other side of the room, and when he takes the hostage at gunpoint and you have to sneak up on him to defeat him. But other than that, there's not much else to it, as yes, the side mission itself with the crime scene is pretty cool to do, but it's just one crime scene that leads to the boss fight, which is essentially just like City's mission but on a way smaller scale. But at least this boss fight actually gives us some sort of challenge rather than none at all in Arkham City, as apparently these companies have a big problem with building up a character just to have nothing to show in the end. But overall, Deadshot was just a huge missed opportunity since he has no part to play in the main story whatsoever, and for a game praised for such amazing boss fights, this should have been the game to give Deadshot a good boss fight, but instead we got a subpar Predator mission with a really short side mission, and that's why it's this low on this list at the number 8 spot and not anywhere higher. But next up at number 7 is Lady Shiva's boss fight, and just like Deadshot, she was introduced at the beginning of the game as one of the assassins that Black Mask hired to kill Batman, but ultimately was turned into a side mission which, surprise surprise, was really short and ended with a really bad boss fight, it being another combat section. Now, I'm gonna be honest here, this combat section in particular was a little harder than all the others, because instead of dealing with regular thugs like we usually do, you're only fighting against ninjas, which are much harder to deal with than regular thugs as they use swords, and when countering them, you have to counter twice in order for that counter to be successful. Now, the biggest reason why this boss fight is so low on this list, and why I say it was really bad, is because Lady Shiva is supposed to be one of the greatest fighters in the DC universe, as not even someone like Batman could beat her in hand-to-hand combat. But tell me how Deathstroke got a cool cinematic and technical fight with Batman, but someone superior to him in combat like Shiva got downgraded to having a regular combat section as her boss fight. Sure, you could say there are little cinematic sequences within the fight, like the ending for example, but other than that, you're just fighting ninjas with Shiva in the mix. I just think Shiva should have gotten a proper hand-to-hand fight like Deathstroke did, because she and the fans got robbed of what could have been an amazing boss fight. But the worst thing about it all is that she never even shows up in Arkham Knight after being let go in Origins, because out of all the assassins in the game, Shiva's the only one that gets away, and her case file being left open as well. It was just so disappointing to see this happen to such a cool character, and someone who Batman lore-wise legitimately struggles to beat in a one-on-one fight. I just hope at some point she returns to the series, but her fight in Origins definitely deserves place at number 7 position on this list. But next up at number 6 on this list is the Killer Croc boss fight, which takes place at the very beginning of the game and is the very first boss fight we're faced with to get a taste of what's to come, and oh boy, did this fight not disappoint, especially for the first in the game. But before we get into the boss fight, I just want to say how well the beginning of the game leading into this boss fight was actually paced, and the fact that the game essentially opened up with a really strong fight, as in the other games in the series and in most other games in general, you usually don't get into a boss fight this fast, with the first major fight happening probably 30 minutes to an hour from when you start playing the game. But the first fight literally happens in the opening of the game, as you're set straight into the action, being dropped outside the prison and making your way onto the rooftop where you come face to face with Killer Croc. Now, I must say that this isn't the hardest boss fight in the world, which all things considered, if you're going to have a boss fight in the opening of the game, it really shouldn't be that difficult, as the player is still warming up to the game in general and probably needs a better grasp of the controls. But I think as a whole, this fight is just as difficult as it needed to be, and makes you learn the skills for upcoming fights like Bane, for example, which is essentially the Killer Croc fight but much harder. It's also really short compared to the others, but that's just if you focus on Croc for the entire length of the fight. But usually people would try to take care of the thugs first and then focus on Croc for the final blows. But I think overall, this fight uses many skills that you can use throughout the course of the game and gives the player a good experience to prepare for the rest of the game. The only reason why this fight isn't higher is because, in my opinion, all the other assassins are much better and put up way more of a challenge than this one. And as I said before, it's just an easier version of the Bane fight. But the one thing I did like about this fight are the semi-cinematic moments where you have to escape Croc's grasp, as it shows how much of a threat Croc really is to Batman and that he isn't someone you get to make mistakes around. In my opinion, this and Assam's Scarecrow boss are the best opening fights in the entire series, and this fight definitely deserves a spot at the number 6 position on this list. But next up at number 5 on this list is Copperhead, and her fight is one of the harder ones on this list, as you're essentially fighting a bunch of clones of her, as they're all treated as bladed enemies, which is where countering becomes more difficult, and she's able to dodge attacks like Shiva does in her fight. I think the hardest thing about this fight is how fast you can really lose to her, as her clones come at you faster than a lot of enemies in this game, and they come at you at one after the other, so it becomes really difficult to get through the longer the fight goes on for. The fight is split up into 3 phases, the last being the hardest, as she dashes into Batman dealing damage, only leaving a second to jump out of the way. I think the coolest thing about Copperhead's section is that her venom is sort of treated like the Scarecrow's fear toxin in a sense, as on your way to the actual fight, Batman starts hallucinating things such as Alfred doubting his efforts as Batman and Commissioner Lowe being killed at the beginning of the game by Black Mask. I think out of all the fights in this game, Copperhead's is truly the only one that actually warranted being a combat section, as her style of fighting was purely based on the fact that Batman was poisoned and would hallucinate multiple versions of her, giving her an advantage, which played really well in this fight. But every other fight in this game, like Black Mask and Anarchy for example, that did have the style of combat as their bosses, really shouldn't have and should have been something completely different. As yes, they could have had some elements of the style of combat in their fight, fights because it is a predominantly combat driven game, but it definitely shouldn't have been its main mechanic. The only negative thing I will say about this fight, however, is that it's the only time we ever actually encounter her in the entire game. She literally never shows up again later on in the game after you beat her, as guys like Bane and Firefly are seen causing havoc throughout the entire game, but you only get to see Copperhead in a couple scenes talking to Joker, and then eventually getting beat up by Batman and left to be taken away by GSPD at the end. I just think we should have been able to fight her more than once in this game, but have a much more difficult fight than the first, since she's an escape artist after all. This goes for Deathstroke as well in my opinion, but we'll get to that later on when we speak about him, because I really think he should have been in the game more than that one good boss fight we got at the beginning. But overall, I think this fight was designed really well for Copperhead, and I like the fact that the difficulty spike of this fight compared to everything else we were faced with before was pretty big, and showed that the assassins can be very deadly when they want to be, just like Deathstroke, and is why this boss fight deserves a spot at the number 5 position on this list. But moving on to number 4 on this list, in which we have the Firefly boss fight, and in my opinion, this was both one of the coolest boss fights in the entire game, and at the same time, one of the most boring ones in my opinion. But before you start shouting at me in the comments below about how it's one of your favorite boss fights in the entire game, hear me out, because I think I bring up a few valid points here. The first thing I want to talk about is the entire level design and the build up to this fight, because at this point in the game, Firefly had planted bombs on either side of the bridge, and Batman needs to defuse all 4 of them before Firefly gets a chance to activate them. But with Gordon refusing to help Batman, it makes things a tad bit harder, because by the time Batman climbs up to the actual bridge, one of the bombs are still active since Gordon refuses to cooperate with Batman to disarm them. But once you defuse the final bomb and actually start climbing the bridge, you start to realize how huge this thing really is, and that the bridge we once were flying across up to this point is an absolute war zone, with Firefly causing havoc above with his flamethrower. In my opinion, the climbing sections of this bridge are some of the best designed moments in this game, as it makes you feel like Firefly is a huge threat, and with the amount of destruction he's made above, it makes you feel like he's the final boss as you hear and feel the rumblings from below the bridge. Because apart from Firefly, who else in the Arkham games has really caused this much physical destruction to Gotham itself? Because other than Hugo Strange's RPGs at the end of Arkham City, Firefly was probably one of the biggest threats to Gotham destruction wise than any of the other characters in the series. But that's the build up, which in my opinion was really well done and made Firefly's aura really dangerous the entire time. But now for the boss fight itself, which starts off with a relatively lengthy combat section, which is also somewhat difficult as it uses a variety of enemies with different weapons, but it isn't the hardest in the world, which is honestly fine, as it shows that we need to find a way to earn the fight with Firefly. But now comes the actual face off with Firefly, which long story short is just Batman spamming glue grenades and using the batarangs to bring down his health. Now I will say that the boss does feel more like a level than an actual boss, with all the parkour sections to it, which is such a unique design in my opinion, and the devs at WB Montreal did an amazing job with it. But when it came to actually fighting Firefly directly, it was just the same thing over and over again, and even though it was somewhat difficult to dodge some of his bombs, overall it wasn't the hardest thing in the world, and all you do is spam the grenades and use the backclaw to pull him down 3 or so times and the fight's over. The ending section where he pulls you through the air and you have to counter certain objects is really cool as well, and stuff like that should have been implemented into the fight more, actually deal damage to him, and maybe one of those glue grenade sections as one way to do it. But it definitely should not have been the main mechanic of this fight, and should have had multiple different ways that you have to go through to deal damage to him, instead of only having one way and making it feel repetitive. And that's why Firefly's boss fight is both one of the best and one of the worst boss fights in this entire game, because in my opinion the pros definitely outweigh the cons, but the cons are present in the most important parts of this fight, which is why it's at number 4 on this list and not any higher. Mr. Freeze is up next on this list at the number 3 spot within the Cold Heart DLC, and we all know that the storytelling in this is amazing, as it's a recreation of the Heart of Ice episode in the Batman animated series, as it shows off Mr. Freeze's origins with a few differences of course here and there. But this boss fight is sitting at number 3 purely because it's just a smaller version of the Mr. Freeze fight we get in Arkham City, as in this fight you need to disable 3 cryogenic reactors so that you're able to weaken Mr. Freeze and make him vulnerable to your attacks, which is made difficult as armed thugs roam the room, and as soon as you start destroying a reactor, both Mr. Freeze and the thugs move to your location and start attacking you. Mr. Freeze predominantly using his freeze gun, and after you destroy all 3, it turns into a stealth mission similar to Arkham City's version of Mr. Freeze's boss fight, in which you need to take him down in 3 different ways in order to deal damage to him. But in this fight, the amount of times is reduced to 3 compared to its 5 in Arkham City, which isn't a big jump, but is made much easier in Arkham Origins as you get access to a bunch more tools and are able to be more creative with the attacks. For example, you can use the batarangs on the icicles on the ceiling to drop them on Freeze's head to deal damage to them. It's pretty cool how much freedom you get with the gadgets in this fight, but I think the level design in itself is what makes this boss fight so high on this list, as the direction of this fight is definitely one of the best in the entire game, right next to the Mad Hatter fight, which isn't on this list as you technically never really fight him, only apprehend him at the end. But both the story and level direction of this fight was some of its biggest strengths, as even near the end of the fight, when you've almost taken out all of Mr. Freeze's health, the story is implemented into the actual boss fight, as it turns out that Ferris Boyle was the big bad all along and starts attacking Freeze and literally freezes Batman thinking he's won. But in the end, Batman takes down Boyle and saves both Nora and Freeze's life, which ends the boss fight and the story. The boss fight in itself is challenging at times, especially the beginning with the reactors and the stealth section with Freeze, but I think with both the story implementation and the actual gameplay combining into one, just gives for one of the best experiences in this entire game, game, and is only in the 3rd position on this list because the next two coming up are just better than this fight overall, even though there really isn't anything negative to say about it. But in my opinion, it's definitely one of the best boss fights out of any of the Arkham games in the entire series, and definitely deserves a spot in the top 3 on this list. And now we've reached the number 2 position on this list, which is the Bane boss fight. And technically there are 3 times that you actually face Bane in this game, 2 of them being very similar to each other and the last being completely different. But in this list, I'm just counting Bane as one and taking everything into consideration when choosing his ranking. So let's go over every boss fight to see what it's really about. The first encounter you have with Bane is when you meet both him and Joker at the Royal Hotel, where the first boss fight takes place, as it's essentially just a glorified version of the first Killer Croc fight, as all you do is super stun him and beat him down multiple times until the fight ends. This along with the several thugs that jump down and being able to dodge Bane's charge attack as well. This pattern continues into the second encounter near the end of the game, where you fight him at Blackgate Prison, in which you do pretty much the same thing, but at this point you have access to the glue grenade, which gives you a greater advantage and more time to take out all the other thugs surrounding him, so you're not stopped when beating him down. Now, by no means am I saying that these 2 fights are easy in the slightest, because they really aren't, especially the second one, as dodging his charge attacks are pretty hard, as you either time your jumps or run around the screen until he stops. And finding the right times to super stun him and beat him down is also sort of hard as well, as he punches at really weird times. But once you get a hang of the patterns, you should be fine. The only thing I don't like about these fights is the fact that they use the exact same mechanic for both of these fights, but just made it slightly harder the second time around, as the third and final encounter is completely different and is probably one of the most intense boss fights in the entire game, as Bane injects himself with the TN1 formula, turning him into a legitimate monster and a really huge threat for Batman, as your goal is to take him down 3 times in a row using the electric doors to eventually defeat him. Now, if they had done something different for the second fight and kept the last fight the same as it is, I really wouldn't be mad, because they wouldn't have reused the exact same mechanic 2 times in a row. But instead they did, which isn't necessarily bad, because the second fight is way harder than the first, but again, it's just repetitive for no reason. The final fight, in my opinion, was probably one of the most unique ways to implement a stealth section within a closed space, as yes, you're doing the same takedowns the whole time, but just like Mr. Freeze's fight, you can't use the same technique of takedown more than once, as Bane stops you from doing them as he rips out the grates and destroying the vents. But overall, I think just because Bane has so much to give in this game as a villain, and the fact that you get 3 full-on boss fights with him just automatically puts him at the top, and this is one of the only times we ever actually get to face Bane before his brain gets fried from the TN1. And in my opinion, his whole character arc definitely paid off in the end with an amazing boss fight, and wasn't just sacked off like he was in Arkham City with just one cutscene. Bane definitely had some of the best and unique boss fights in this game, with them also putting up a great challenge in order to defeat them, which is why Bane's fight definitely deserves his number 2 ranking on this list over all the other ones. And now we've reached the part you've all been waiting for, and after everything that's been said throughout this entire video, it's time to finally answer the question you've all been so eagerly patient to hear. What is the best boss fight in all of Batman Arkham Origins? But before we get to the number 1 spot on this list, don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. If you made it this far into the video, as I post videos every single week on Sunday and have tons of shorts dedicated strictly to the Arkham games on this channel as well. So if you're into that sort of thing, subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell to keep up with my weekly uploads, as it helps me out a lot. But now with the promo out of the way, let's get to the number 1 spot on this list with the greatest Batman Arkham Origins boss fight, which is the Deathstroke boss fight, which collectively agreed upon within the community as one of the greatest boss fights to ever be made in the Batman Arkham series, period. Now, the reason why it's at the number 1 spot on this list is strictly because it's a full-on technical hand-to-hand fight between 2 of the greatest fighters in the DC universe. There's no thugs, no interference from outside sources, just a straight-up one-on-one fight between 2 very skilled fighters. Now, this boss fight isn't easy either, as in most combat sections within any of the Arkham games, you'll see that you can really counter everything whenever you want, no matter how early or late, as long as you hit the button while the counter icon is on screen. But for this fight, you have to time your counters perfectly in order to actually counter the attack, or else Deathstroke is able to deal damage to you for free. You also can't just keep spamming the same attacks 24/7, as Deathstroke starts to dodge them, such as the backclaw for example, which is a really useful gadget in this fight. You really have to strategize on the move within this fight, or else you'll just get beaten. And there are countless of players that I have seen, including myself, that have taken hours to beat this fight because it's just that hard to beat, which is honestly amazing in my opinion, because if a boss like a guy like Deathstroke was easy, it'd be really disappointing. But the fact that this fight was made to be straight up a 1v1 and difficult as well just puts this fight on a whole new level and really makes this the best boss fight in this entire game. The opening cutscene in my opinion is probably the best in this entire game as well, as it just transitions so well from interrogating Penguin to fighting against a complete menace. The one thing I will say that was kind of weird when playing this is that the spam counterparts of this fight is completely ripped off of the Ra's al Ghul fight in Arkham City, as the exact same sequence and the animation takes place in this game as well. I'm not saying it's bad because it really fits this fight, I just think they could have done something different in that one section, like a longer quick time event sequence like they do in the middle of the fight for example, in replacement for the spam counter sequence. But either way, it fits the fight anyway, so I'm not mad whatsoever. Overall, this fight is one of the greatest decisions to ever be made for this game. Even though the game gets hate in general for being the worst in the series, it still gave us one of the best boss fights out of the entire series, and probably in superhero games in general, as the moment we saw Deathstroke in the trailer, WB Montreal knew exactly the mission and absolutely delivered on so many levels. I just wish the Shiva boss fight could have been similar or made into a completely new one-on-one style apart from the Deathstroke fight, maybe on a rooftop or some other high place in the city. But ultimately it isn't what happened and was such a missed opportunity from the studio. But overall, Batman Arkham Origins gave us some of the best boss fights in this entire series, with Deathstroke being the best out of all of them, deserving of his #1 spot on this list, and that's all I gotta say about that. And with that, we've reached the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel as I post videos every single week and have several shorts on this channel dedicated to the Arkham games, so you're always power content no matter what. Click on the bat symbol to check out my ranking of every Batman Arkham DLC in the series, which is very similar to this video, so if you like this one, you should definitely give that one a watch. And also check out the video to the right of that to check out a video that I think you'd like on my channel. And again, chances are, if you like this one, you'll probably enjoy that one as well. I hope you all have an amazing rest of your day, and I'll see you all next week with another video. Peace!